all day.
Yes, sir.
All right, we'll call to order this meeting of the Finance and Audit Committee for the Sacramento Metropolitan Fire District. We'll open up with a public opportunity to comment, discuss matters of public interest in the agenda, on or not on the agenda, excuse me. Do we have any speakers?
There are no speakers this evening.
We'll move on next to the consent calendar.
Mr. Chair, I move the consent calendar.
And I will be happy to second that motion.
Can we get the vote, please?
Director Kelly,
Aye.
Director Jones,
Aye.
and Director Wood.
Aye.
Motion passes.
All right, next up, we have one action item. It's the election of officers. We need to nominate and elect a chair and a vice chair for 2016. Do we have any nominations for the chair?
If it pleases the group, I would like to propose that Mr. Wood continue on as chair of the Finance Committee. I think he's done a fine job up to this point and would like to see him continue.
For the last 3 minutes, thank you.
I would support that as well if our fellow director's willing to continue.
All right, do we need to vote each one individually, or can we do a group?
I would do individually,
All right,
yes.
then let's call for the vote, please.
So I have a motion by Director Kelly, a second by Director Jones.
Correct.
Director Kelly,
Aye.
Director Jones,
Aye.
and Director Wood.
Aye.
Motion passes.
And next, we'll need to elect a vice chair for the 2016 calendar year. To nominate Director Jones.
I would second that nomination.
Thanks for getting that in before she had the chance to say no. We got a motion and a second. Can we get the vote, please?
Director Kelly,
Aye.
Director Jones,
Aye.
and Director Wood.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Moving on to the presentation items. First one is CFO Thomas. Good day.
Good evening, directors, Chief Wells. I do actually have a presentation. I could pull that up. Okay, so this presentation item is to discuss the obligation that the district has with respect to an unfunded liability with the Sacramento County Employees Retirement System, or SCERS, and also to present staff's plan for addressing the obligation and get any feedback the committee may have on that plan. So just in terms of background, the employees of the Florin Fire Protection District, which, as you know, is a predecessor agency to the district, were included as members of SCERS for the service that was provided prior to January 1st, 1997. In 1997, the district entered into a termination agreement with SCERS, providing for an annual recalculation of the unfunded liability associated with the former Florin members. So for service provided after 1997, those former members were members of CalPERS. According to the terms of that agreement, if at any time the unfunded liability exceeds 5% of assets, the parties are to meet and confer to reach an agreement on the payments that are required to eliminate the liability by July 1st, 2022, or another date mutually agreed upon by the parties. If the obligations are not met under the terms of the agreement, the county is authorized to transfer to SCERS any available district funds from the county treasury to satisfy the obligations. As of June 30th, 2014, the unfunded liability was approximately $28.7 million. And that's calculated as liabilities of $76 million, less assets in the plan allocated to the district of about $47.4 million. The unfunded liability represents 61% of assets, so that's compared to the 5% test over which we're required to meet and confer and agree upon a payment schedule to satisfy the liability. So we're obviously well in excess of that 5%. The unfunded liability has increased dramatically since 1997, has continued to steadily increase over the last several years, despite annual payments made by the district. So we have been contributing about 1.1 million annually, but that really hasn't been sufficient to keep pace with the interest charged by SCERS on the liability amount and then other actuarial changes that, that result in differences in the unfunded liability on a year-to-year basis. So looking at the options for eliminating the unfunded liability, we can obviously increase annual payments to SCERS through the existing remaining term of 2022. That would be one option. We can also look at doing increased annual payments through an extended agreement term, and SCERS has indicated a willingness to extend the term of the termination agreement. And then the third option here is actually looking at issuing debt and using the proceeds of that debt to satisfy the obligation with SCERS and end the termination agreement. Looking at the SCERS payment options, a couple of things to keep in mind. So all SCERS payment options would include annual payments to SCERS with interest calculated at their assumed discount rate, which is currently 7.5%. So that's the interest that they would charge us on an annual basis. And then the unfunded liability would continue to be calculated annually as it is currently, so that would result in payment fluctuation. So on a year-to-year basis, we would reassess, what is the current unfunded liability, and payments would be adjusted as a result. So looking at the two SCERS payment options, sticking with the existing term or extending the term to something longer, paying off the current unfunded liability by the end of the existing agreement term in 2022 would require annual payments of about $5.4 million. Given the district's current financial situation, that doesn't appear to be a feasible option. Looking instead at extending the term of the agreement with SCERS through 2040, so approximately 25 years, that would result in annual payments of about $2.6 million to SCERS. So as an alternative to coming to some sort of payment arrangement with SCERS, we looked at instead issuing bonds and using those proceeds to satisfy that obligation. Benefits of that approach would include a much lower interest rate. So right now we're looking at an estimated interest rate based on information provided by our financial advisors of about 4.6% compared to the 7.5% that SCERS would charge. And then we would have fixed annual payments. So there would be a set amount that would satisfy our obligation. We would issue bonds for that amount, and then we would know what the debt service on those bonds would be for the term of those bonds, and for purposes of this analysis, we have assumed those would be 25-year bonds. So looking at that term through 2040, we would have estimated annual payments under this option of about $2 million. So obviously a substantial savings compared to the option of extending the term with SCERS. The total interest that would be saved, through 2040 would be about $14 million compared to looking at extending the term with SCERS. So that appears to be the best option available to us, and that's the option that we're looking to pursue. The next steps in doing that would be to complete actuarial studies. So SCERS has indicated a willingness to work with us on this approach and to have their actuary update the actuarial studies to determine the unfunded liability as of June 30th, 2015 and December 31st, 2015. And then using the results of those studies, we would reach an agreement with SCERS on what the final termination amount would be and the date at which that would be paid. We would work with our financial advisor to determine what the optimal structure would be for the bond financing, and then we would return to the board for approval of both the bond financing and the amendment to the SCERS termination agreement. With that, I would be happy to take any questions or feedback that the committee may have.
So what I'm gathering, and I apologize for not paying closer attention previous to this point, but what you're trying to do is get out from under the monthly payments that we're responsible for. or the annual payments that we're responsible for?
Well, we're currently making annual payments, but they're really not sufficient to address the total liability that's outstanding. And the agreement as it stands today, absent, any changes that would need to be agreed upon by both parties, requires us to satisfy that liability as of July 1st, 2022. So we're looking at a way to sort of come up with a payment structure that obviously, can be accommodated within the district's financial position, but will result in a plan to satisfy that obligation.
Have we determined how many individuals are still participating under the SCERS program?
Yes, sorry, I have that information. So as of June 30th, 2014, there were 34 active members, and combination of inactive, retired beneficiaries / survivors of 107, so total 141 individuals.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Good evening, Amanda. I have a few different questions here. Are there other agencies that are in the same position as Metro Fire in relation to SCERS?
I'm not aware of any that are in the same position in terms of the size of the unfunded liability. I believe that there are other agencies that have terminated. The only one that I'm aware of actually has a small net asset, so not in the same position that we are.
So we're in a class by ourselves on this one.
Yeah, and in talking with SCERS, this is really something new for them also. This isn't a situation that they have really had to address, but they want to work with us to find a solution that will work.
What is SCERS' overall financial health?
I'm not sure.
Opinion,
that
I know, but just ballpark. A+, C+.
I'm really not prepared to address that. I
Okay, I guess that was a loaded question, but I'm trying to figure out what's going on here, because how do they, and maybe this is just a rhetorical question then, how do they come up with 7.5?
Oh, the discount rate. So that's what they assume their investments will earn. So that's the assumed rate of return for the plan.
I believe that's the same as CalPERS as well, though, correct?
I believe that's correct.
But they want to charge us that interest rate as if we were, well, that's.
Right, on the theory that if they had that money, that's what they would be earning on the money.
Okay. It's my recollection is that when this all started, this was a very low number. And over the last, 19 years now, this has expanded, to say the least. And is this the story of our unfunded liabilities in general, or how much of this is just particular to our unique position with taking care of the SCERS employees?
I think we've seen increases in liabilities associated with our CalPERS plans, but those have been, I think, addressed more on an ongoing basis, right through the rates that we pay. I think that not only did we see an escalation here, but there wasn't a corresponding escalation in the payments that were made over time.
Okay. Well, it sounds like now we're going to address it, and your recommendation was the latter of these in terms of redoing some bond financing, satisfying SCERS, and then just dealing with that particular financial tool.
Correct.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Anything further? When is the expected return to the board for discussion and approval of this?
So we're hoping to be able to wrap up and get the results of the actuarial studies. I would say sometime within the next couple of months. This SCERS will need to address this with their board, so there may be a period of months while they're getting direction to ensure that this would happen. I would like to say that it's something that we could be back within the next 6 months, ideally, by the end of the fiscal year.
All right. Anything further?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Thomas. You can stay there because you got the next presentation item as well.
Correct. So now I just need to figure out how to get that one up. Okay, so this presentation is our normal Finance Committee report, and this is for the period or the 4 months ended October 31st, 2015. So the first chart that we look at is the cash balance history. And I will, point out a couple of things that I probably typically point out, but just to refresh your memory. This includes all of the cash of the district, so it's not just the general fund that we're looking at here, it's all funds. But it is purely cash, so we're not looking at reserves here, we're just looking at overall cash balance. And at this point in the year, you can see, looking at the red line, that the district is in a negative cash position with a negative balance of about $7.7 million. You can see, and I believe I pointed this out at the last report, that our cash position is lower this year than it has been, as of the same point in time in previous years. And that is because this year we prepaid a portion of our PERS contribution. So there was an upfront payment in July of $17 million, which otherwise would have been spread out throughout the year, so you would have seen that coming out on a more even basis. It was paid in the beginning of the year, so that reduces the cash early on. We'll see it even out throughout the year. And again, as a reminder, the reason that we did that, the reason for the prepayment, is actually results in a total savings for the year of about $600,000. As with prior years, we do expect the cash balance to continue to decline until we get our first property tax installment. So that's when you see on this chart, typically in January, you see that go back up into positive territory.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I have a quick question about
Oh,
this
yes.
chart, or that one. The red line indicates 2016, and yet it starts in July. Was that meant to be superimposed in January? Or I'm missing something here?
I'm sorry, it's fiscal year 2016.
Okay, so we're anticipating,
So it's the fiscal year that started July of 2015.
okay.
Yes, and will end in June of 2016.
All right, thanks.
So, I guess I have a question. So we can expect that trend of negative funding to continue downward before it begins to move up?
Correct. I mean, in actuality, we have at this point received our first property tax installment because we are, we're sitting in January now. But as we, as the data is compiled and we move through these reports, you'll see that reflected when the reports catch up with that. And you'll see it, as with the green and the purple lines, go back up into positive territory.
Thank you.
So this chart is showing us our general fund operating reserves. Unlike the previous chart, this is not showing a cash balance, and it is specific to the general fund, so those are the differences between the previous chart. And we calculate our general fund reserves by taking our starting reserve balance, adding the general fund revenues that have been received, in this case, through the end of October, and subtracting the general fund expenses through the end of October. As with the cash balance, we do expect that the reserves will continue to decline again until we get that first property tax installment. We're currently at a net negative reserve as of October 31st of about $20.4 million, or negative 11.7%, but we end the year in positive territory. There were a couple of things that I wanted to point out, particularly in the table at the bottom of this chart, that are changes since the last time I did this report. So the last report was for the 2 months ended August 31st. And since that time, a couple of things have happened. The board adopted a budget amendment, so we're changing both our net budgeted expenditures versus the last report, as well as what we expect our deficit this year to be relative to the last report. And then the other thing that happened is that we have finalized the results for fiscal year 14-15, which results in a revised beginning balance of the reserve. So just to point out what those changes were, the last version of this report, we had a beginning general fund reserve balance of about $21.2 million, or $21.1 million roughly. So we're seeing an increase in the beginning balance of $1.4 million. That's resulting primarily to additional medic cost recovery revenues that were accrued after the end of fiscal year 14-15. So the preliminary beginning balance was based on cash revenues, and when we looked at the revenue accruals, that resulted in an increase. And then additionally, there was a transfer from the grant fund to the general fund that was essentially reimbursing the general fund for grant eligible labor costs that were paid out of the general fund. So those two things resulted in an increase in the general fund reserve beginning balance of about $1.4 million. Then the other change that I mentioned was the budget amendment. So we had a decrease in our net budgeted expenditures, which are the denominator that we use in calculating the reserve ratio. As a result of the budget amendment, that decrease was about $2.3 million. And then we had an increase in our expected use of reserves during the year as a result of a larger deficit in the budget amendment than the final budget, and that increase in the use of reserves was about $1.3 million. So with all of those changes, we went from a projected ending reserve of 11.4% to now a projected ending reserve of 11.6%. So moving on, the next several charts compare our actual results to date to the amounts budgeted for the year and then the prior year actual amounts. So this chart is showing one of our revenue sources, medic cost recovery. And you can see that through the first 4 months of the year, we are showing at about $12 million a higher amount than was received during the same period last year, and then what the budget reflects. We've essentially, as you can look all the way to the end of the total budget of $31.9 million, we essentially budgeted for the same amount that we saw in the cash receipts for last fiscal year. And when we compare to the previous year, this $12 million that we've seen so far through the end of October compares to about $10.7 million. We really saw most of that increase in September. It was a very strong September based on those cash numbers. So at this point, it does appear, based on this and what we've seen so far year to date, that these revenues are trending above last year and the budgeted amount. We'll need to do more analysis to understand why and what that might mean for the rest of the year, but, based on what we're seeing so far, it does appear that there's an improvement in this, this revenue source, and that's something that, after we're able to complete the analysis, we'll likely address at mid-year budget in terms of a revision to this budget. So this chart is looking at total revenues, and total revenues so far through the end of October were about $16.5 million. You can see that the $12 million of medic cost recovery represented the majority of that revenue, because we've yet to receive our property tax revenues as of the end of October. And this is trending slightly ahead of last year and budget expectations. I did want to point out that the budgeted number for the full year of $176.7 million, based on the amended budget, that's now a lower number than the prior year actual total revenues, and that is the result of the change in IGT revenue. So when we look at the revenue line, we're actually seeing the impact of the change in gross revenue. We obviously have an offsetting reduction in expenses too, because there's a lower amount that's transferred, but overall it was a reduction to revenues as a result of that change. So turning to expenses, this chart shows salaries and benefits expenses, and those expenses totaled about $47.8 million through October, which is slightly ahead of budget. But one thing to point out is that we do not budget for deployments in preliminary and final budget. We typically come and add those back in based on actual experience at mid-year. So you're seeing that expense reflected in the actuals, but not yet reflected in the budget. So that, again, is something that will be addressed at mid-year budget. And then this chart is showing total expenditures. So again, you can see that the labor expenses of about $47.8 million represent the majority of total expenses of $59.4 million so far for the first 4 months of the year. And again, that's trending ahead of budget, both because of deployments and also because we have a $1.3 million expense for the P25 radios that will get added in at mid-year budget but is not yet reflected in this budget number. We also have an offsetting revenue due to the financing of that expense that, again, is reflected in the revenue numbers in the actuals but not yet in the budget, and that will be addressed at mid-year as well. And then the final slide shows the balance in our SERP fund. So this is our OPEB trust fund. So as of October 31st, 2015, the balance was about $15.2 million, and that included contributions to date of about $14.7 million and net earnings of approximately $600,000. So just to wrap up a bit by summarizing some of the key points, again, wanted to mention that the ending reserve ratio is now expected to be 11.6% based on the final beginning balance in the general fund reserve as well as the amended budget, and that compared to 11.4% that we were showing in the previous report. The medic cost recovery revenues are trending above budget and prior year actuals. That most of that increase is attributable to strong September revenues. Really more analysis is needed to determine what an appropriate budget adjustment would be, but we do expect to see a change to this figure at mid-year budget. And overall, revenues and expenses are both trending ahead of budget due to the reasons that I mentioned, largely the deployments and the medic cost recovery revenues, as well as the P25 radios, and those are all things that we expect to address at mid-year budget. Through October, our expenses exceeded our revenues by about $43 million, which contributed to negative net reserves as of the end of that period, and use of the dry period funding, but that is consistent with our experience in prior years, as of this point in the year. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Anything?
No questions. Pretty straightforward.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that, CFO Thomas. All right, our next meeting date is set for February 25th, 2016. At that time, it looks like we're going to be getting our mid-year budget presentation, so we're looking forward to that. Any comments or discussions before we close?
No, Mr. Chair?
Thank you. This meeting is adjourned until February.
Stay there. I'm going to give you a little hug.